Thanks, Scott. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for the introduction. I wanted to talk tonight a little bit about building compassion and empathy. It's a component in a workshop I'm doing starting Monday, so it's a little bit of a shameless self-plug here, on building intimacy skills for men in recovery. And that's part one, and part two of that is healthy sexuality in recovery. And just based on a lot of experience over the years of doing this work, I've discovered that basically in recovery, not just men, women, everybody really struggles to find out what is intimacy, what does it mean? But this particular workshop, which starts Monday evening, is geared toward men in recovery. And it's 6 weeks, 90 minutes, just like our other work groups here. And I'm pretty excited about it. Again, we've run it several times, been very successful. But I do want to talk tonight specifically about one piece of that, what we cover in there. And that's this piece about building compassion and empathy, which is a real struggle for people, but it's really one of the essential features that really has to be reinstilled into a relationship, or things aren't going to go very well. So I want to just take a piece of what we do tonight, and that is really looking at the components of compassion and empathy. What is it? And it's a word we toss around a lot, but I think it's useful to break it down and really look at that and how it applies to addicts in recovery, particularly men in recovery. So the four components we talk about with empathy are self-knowledge, comfort, and connection. I'll go over these in a minute. Being conscious and present, and finally, empathy with emotion. There's a couple different kinds of empathy. So to take that first one, self-knowledge, that has all kinds of other components too. And one of the processes that we find when we get into recovery is that kind of all the old coping skills that addiction represented, all the old patterns, a lot of dysfunction, core beliefs about ourselves that maybe we feel unworthy or unlovable, or all that stuff starts to come up to the surface because it's no longer hidden under all the behaviors and or drugs. And so really learning how to have that self-knowledge, to learn how to be comfortable with yourself. When we start feeling emotions, there's a lot of discomfort with that. And that directly impacts the ability to be intimate with anybody. If we can't trust, if we can't be vulnerable, then that really is an issue. We have to know and accept who we are. That a lot of times we use addiction to kind of as a social lubricant, if you will, to disinhibit ourselves when we have worries about our body, or worries about performance, or worries about not being enough, all those things. And I think we have to really look at that in recovery, because we're no longer numb to it, but we're starting to feel and really start to understand and accept who we are. And that's a process, of course, that takes time, but really coming to terms with our past, with our present, and the situation we find ourselves in, being willing to work through tough and longstanding issues. We often talk about the essential place of trauma therapy in recovery, and not too soon, as we've said often here, because if we take away the coping skills of somebody, which is their addiction, and throw them into trauma therapy too soon, it'll really overwhelm their capacity to deal with it. But I think eventually we have to deal with these long-standing issues. Maybe I've always had trouble being willing to share my feelings. Well, not just in my current relationship, but way back, right? So these are long-standing issues that we have to sort of look at, and that often takes, if not always, takes the help of a mental health professional, therapist, particularly a CSAT. And then finally, that self-knowledge piece is really understanding who am I? What are my values? And then starting to live within those, right? It's really defining who and what we want to be, and starting to live with integrity in that. So that's one. The second one, comfort and connection. And this is where we start to talk about the ability to be comfortable in our own skin. Addiction, in many ways, is a self-soothing mechanism. We soothe ourselves, we numb ourselves, we distract ourselves, but we're very often not comfortable in our own skin unless we're being distracted or numbed somehow. And so I think in recovery, it's really important to learn how to just learn techniques of soothing yourself, of re-regulating your emotions, because life happens. We all get kind of thrown off, but it's so important to be able to have that skill of bringing ourselves back to center, being able to re-regulate our emotions. And that's incredibly important. And that means another skill we talk about is tolerating tension. So many of us just can't sit in discomfort. And sometimes even in a marriage or a relationship in early recovery, a lot of times we don't know what's going to happen. A lot of times the spouse rightfully decides, well, I can't really say if I'm going to stay or not until I have the disclosure, till I know everything, right? How can I make that decision? So, and that creates tension, right? It creates a discomfort. It's like, okay, I have to live for a period of months with this unresolved issue. Those are the kinds of things that can start to eat away at somebody. And we have to have tools to be able to deal with that, because that is life, right? And we always don't have black and white answers when we want them. And that also means not reacting out of old patterns. And I make a distinction between reacting, which is kind of all this, just like it sounds, an automatic response, versus actually responding, which I define as kind of being more thoughtful, considerate, not reacting out of some old pattern, or because my partner reminds me of my father, or all that stuff that is so common, but to really learn how to sit in it and deal with it. The third one is comfort. Being conscious and present. So taking responsibility for our actions, right? Learning how to be in our lives now, not mired in the past, not in the future, but really starting to take responsibility, good and bad, for what happens, what we do, to really honor our commitments. You know, these are the kinds of elements of living in integrity, which over time can really directly contribute to the ability to be intimate and have a robust intimacy in one's relationship, or even with friends. It's a different kind of intimacy. It's not the primary intimacy we get with a partner, but we have relationships, good relationships with friends, which can also be described as intimate. So we have to manage our moods. We have to be honest. We have to be trustful. We have to do what we say and say what we do. And you know, for sex addicts particularly, and we talked about this issue too, there's a lot of lying, at least in the beginning, and I believe that's directly related to shame. You know, I lied because if you really knew what was going on inside me, you'd be disturbed or disgusted or would run. And so I can't let you near that. And so gradually in recovery, starting to come to terms with that and be me, and allow myself to be seen in a relationship. And then finally, empathy with emotion. And this is a distinction that a lot of people haven't heard before, but there's really two kinds of empathy. And remember, empathy is the ability to feel what somebody else is feeling. And if I, as a recovering addict, I'm still struggling to figure out what am I feeling, it's really hard to have any kind of common language with someone to understand what they might be feeling as well. So this is a skill that develops. But we talk about empathy with emotion versus cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is this idea, well, I know what I should say. I know what I should think, just because I'm smart and I know my partner. So, you know, you must be feeling sad, or you must be feeling lonely, or whatever, but we're still not feeling it. We can express it, and we may be right or wrong, but it's kind of an academic exercise because it's coming from our head. What we're wanting to do, and what this course helps people do, is move from up here down to our heart. And really, and that's where empathy with emotion starts to happen. It's not just saying the right words, which kind of land kind of hollow in many cases, but really feeling it with feeling, and really getting, I can feel that old expression, I can feel your pain. That's kind of literally what empathy is. We can feel what somebody else is feeling. We can feel their hurt. We can feel their loneliness. We can feel their sadness. And that hurts. But it's so essential in order to really heal a relationship. If two people are not on the same emotional vibration, if you will, at least some of the time, it's going to be really hard to create intimacy, and then down the road, even healthy sexuality as well. But here, tonight we're talking about intimacy. So those are the four things that we focus on here. I'll say them one more time. Self-knowledge about oneself, creating comfort and connection with oneself, and being able to connect to people, being present in that sense, being conscious with ourselves, knowing who we are, and living up to that word and those commitments, and finally, empathy with emotion. So these are just four aspects that we talk about in this big struggle that a lot of recovering men particularly have, building empathy and intimacy. And this is just give you a little idea of what we do in the work group. So if you're interested, if you can find out more at Seeking Integrity. And I think, Scott, maybe sometime you could put a link in. There it is at the top. Perfect. Thank you so much. So, and with that, I think I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Type some questions in. We don't have any yet. So you can ask them about building compassion and empathy, ask them about anything to do with intimacy, anything you would like. I do have one quick question for you, David. this came up in one of my online work groups the other day. It was my sex addiction guys. And we were talking about, the cure for addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And, it's a bunch of men who have been disconnected for a very long time, and developing any kind of intimacy scares the living daylights out of them.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the process of how an addict who has spent, sometimes 30, 40, 50 years escaping connection because it's too scary, how they can start to build connections and then build better connections
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's on the minds of a lot of people recovering, at least early on. I think it really has to start with oneself, right? All those things I spoke of just now about being able to control moods and re-regulate and stay present, live with tension, all those kind of skills that I guess normal people have. I never got them until I got into recovery, but those are kind of the core building blocks of intimacy, and that connection piece you're talking about, that starts inside. And then once we have the ability to kind of stay balanced, stay present, not be overwhelmed, then we start kind of, I think, experimenting. And sometimes surprisingly to the clients we have at Seeking Integrity, we talk about our groups, these groups of men, as really ways to build intimacy. And it's really true. And I think for a lot of guys, intimacy may ultimately happen in their relationship, but I think it starts in some of the relationships they may have with their recovery brothers, with their sponsors, with people. And it starts because they can start to be vulnerable with those people. And one of the core essential ingredients of intimacy is the ability to be vulnerable. I can share with you, that's what I was talking about shame before. All of us carry secrets, and probably everybody that comes into Seeking Integrity says, I have stuff I'm going to take to my grave, and most of the time in a couple of days they're out with it, and they're so relieved because people didn't run screaming from the room. People leaned in and took interest and identified with them, and so suddenly that connection happened, and it happened because they had the courage to take a little risk and be vulnerable about something that was on their mind. And that little dynamic repeated over and over again, I think, is how this connection starts to happen. But I do think it has to start, people will have their training wheels, if you will, with relationships and program with other men, and with male friends and peers and sponsors, and that recovery connection. And then I think that builds upon the ability to really take it into a one-to-one relationship where it's really where that intensity can be pretty strong. And I think that scares a lot of people too. And so if you have somebody waking up in a marriage of 20 years and they've never really felt connected, and that can be overwhelming too for both people. A lot of times the partners have gotten used to someone, they don't like the addiction, but they've gotten used to someone who's kind of not present, not really part of the decision making and all that. And suddenly this person wakes up. And so that can cause its own dynamic. But I think it starts small. It starts with me, and then to my circle of recovering friends, and then ultimately to my relationship.
Yeah. And I think, please type in some questions in the Q&A. We've got one, but we're going to need more than that. One of the things that I truly see missing from almost everyone that I work with, everyone that, not both at Sila and in the work groups, and I know you see it with your clients too, and also at Sila, is intimacy with other men. And I'm not talking about sex. I'm talking, forget that for a minute. Right. Just having somebody or a group of guys who know everything and who can give you advice and walk you through things. And it's just totally missing from the life of almost every addict we deal with. Can you address that a little bit? Yeah.
And I think, frankly, it's representative of men at large in our society. We joke about man rules, but they're very real. That men shouldn't cry or don't cry, and men don't show emotion, and men are tough, and all these kind of stereotypes that a lot of guys live with. But part of that stereotyped presentation of what a man is devoid of feelings and really not having feelings and sometimes not having a right to have feelings, or having the experience of feelings are dangerous. Growing up in a place where they might have gotten hit if they expressed a need or an emotion. So there's all this kind of baggage, not only from our families of origin, but from our culture. And we at Seek Integrity show a couple of videos that deal with this, and it's really powerful. Showing coaches and bullies and parents and all these kind of influences on guys. But I think it starts there. And so men I don't think we have many avenues to connect with each other socially. Now we have sports, I think, and typically men, I think, maybe do sports together or play golf or basketball, and that's how they kind of connect. But in many ways, I think that's superficial when we're talking about the kinds of feelings and emotions and intimacy that we get when we start to be vulnerable. If I'm playing golf or playing basketball with somebody, I'm probably not being very vulnerable with my feelings with whoever I'm playing with. So I think those kind of connections, and I can tell you, like you, I'm sure every guy that has gone through, one of the surprising things that they take out of Seek Integrity is saying, I've never had male friends before. And it's so important, because these are the guys, especially other recovering people, because they can relate to you and you can relate to them. But I think that phenomenon of just assuming, we have this kind of superficial level of interaction with other men, we're cheating ourselves. And again, it's not sexual, it's not any of that. It's about emotional connection and support. And the whole recovery model is that we really rely on our peers for that support, not our spouse, right? And we bring it back to the spouse. We talk to our spouse about what we've done and how we corrected a situation, and we process it. But the initial solutions, I think, come from our peers, from our friends, male friends.
Yeah, and it's also, as you mentioned earlier, the people I was open to in the beginning were my therapist, who I was paying, and other guys in recovery who had the exact same problem, or some version of the exact same problem. It was less scary for me. And over time, as those people responded with empathy and understanding and a lack of judgment, then I was able to open up to a wider circle of people. Unfortunately, and we've talked about this often, it's the betrayed partner who's the last one invited to the intimacy party. But the reason is the betrayed partner is the person who can hurt me the most.
Right. When we think about vulnerability being an essential, feature here, and what are you going to think if you really know what I've been doing or saying or thinking? That's scary. And you're right. And our spouse is the one that can really hurt us the most. So it takes time.
Yeah. Okay. I love this first question here. How long does it typically take to begin building empathy, especially if there has only ever been cognitive empathy?
It's a great question, and I wish I had an easy answer off the tip of my tongue. I think it depends, and I don't mean to give you a cop-out answer here, but I think people have individual experiences in their lives. We talk about family of origin issues that really impact our core beliefs about how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about others, what we expect from relationships. There's all this stuff. And in many cases, the stuff that we've learned and internalized isn't very helpful or downright wrong. And so I think some work has to be undone. There's got to be a lot of healing taking place of the person themselves, and then that building process. And one of the core features, as we know, of sex addiction is shame, and shame is probably the biggest barrier to creating empathy and intimacy, right? Because when there's still a shame core or pockets of shame, that's like a little roadblock. It short circuits the person, like, well, if I really say that, I'm kind of putting myself at risk, because what are they going to think? When we started getting into that self-monitoring, that can be tricky. So, there's all those things that have to kind of be worked on and healed. However, some people that attend this regularly know I'm a big fan of DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. DBT has some exercises that we utilize to start to build compassion and empathy. And the approach there basically is that if someone can learn the skills, learn that cognitive empathy piece, and start to do it, it's almost a model. We have an expression in 12-step program, which I'm going to get wrong, Scott. We kind of do it. What is the expression?
Act as if.
Act as if, right? Yeah.
Bring the body, the mind will follow. Bring the body, the mind will follow. Bring the mind, the heart will follow.
So, and that's actually, and when we look at behavior change, it's often not figuring out what to do and then doing it. It's like stumbling around and practicing it, and then we get better at it. And so I think the more one is open to it, the more one is willing to engage and take risks, emotional risks. And that takes a certain sense of safety from the partner. All those are factors pulling into this. And I think, I have seen, because I'm active in the alumni group Seeking Integrity. So I see guys, we have guys now for about 3.5 years doing great. And I've kind of watched their process. And a lot of them talk about fairly quickly, if they're able to practice this cognitive empathy piece and learn to say the right things, or what should I be thinking? And if they really work their program, I would say in 3 to 6 months, you should be feeling a difference if things are going well. Now, again, that's all highly individual because of individual factors. But I think what I'm looking for here is when people can feel it. And that maybe sounds strange, but it's not just what people are saying and doing. It's kind of, remember, empathy is all about feeling. It's about, you can kind of connect with someone, I believe we know at some point in our gut when we're connecting at an emotional level. I think that's what we're looking for here. And I think that can happen with hard work in some months. And that's the beginning, right? Then it gets better and it gets deeper from there. Great question.
Yeah. Okay, next one here. With regards to touching oneself, where is the line between soothing, like a little boy reflexively holding himself, and sexual gratification?
Okay, so we know self-soothing is a behavior that kind of is innate in humans, and babies do it, and children do it, and some adults do it. I think I'm not sure. I remember a client recently talking about actually rubbing themselves so frequently that their jeans would have a mark, on that. That's definitely beyond the normal. I think kind of any touch like that, I'm pretty concerned about. I think because it's so natural to go there for a lot of people, if that's how they've been self-soothing themselves over time, I think it's more appropriate to probably move it into the realm of emotions and talking about stuff. But I don't know. I'm not sure there's a role for touching oneself in general. Scott, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think there's any hard and fast line between acceptable and unacceptable masturbation or whatever. But I mean, masturbation is a normal thing for addicts. And this is when I get questions like this, I always say, well, I am a sex addict. And if I am, I'm using sexual behaviors and sexual fantasies one way or another to escape from emotional discomfort. I'm using it as a coping mechanism.
Right.
For me, that's the sign of addiction versus normal behaviors. I mean, lots of people have a cocktail after work to unwind, but they're not really doing it because they had a bad day. They're just having a cocktail because it's the end of the day. They want to relax, so people masturbate because they're horny and they don't have anyone else. Some people engage in these behaviors because, I'm having a feeling and I'm uncomfortable having a feeling. So I'm going to self-soothe with a substance or a behavior. That's kind of the crux of addiction for me. One of the questions we ask is, in our 20 question quizzes, do you ever use sexual fantasy or behavior or pornography, masturbation, whatever, to escape emotional discomfort? And if you're an addict, the answer is yes. Yes, I do that all the time. It's my go-to. I don't think, the typical 8-year-old boy, who has to pee or something. I mean, that's just normal. But I don't think that was a very good answer. I think I was kind of all over the place. But to me, the dividing line is, why am I doing it?
Right. And that's kind of what I was trying to say too, not very elegantly, but so that's kind of an indicator that there's something going on with me that I'm uncomfortable with. And I think the more appropriate way to deal with that is to identify, what am I feeling and what do I need to do about it?
Yeah.
That's a little healthier than that, which is a behavior we see sex addicts doing when they're in their sex addiction. So I think it's a tricky go-to for that.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Fawcett brings up the real key to moving forward in a healthier way is identify my feelings. And anytime I'm having an uncomfortable feeling, it's because there's an unmet need under it. I'm feeling lonely. It's uncomfortable. What I need is to feel connected with another person. So I need some stimulation and connection. How can I deal with that? Well, I can avoid feeling it by masturbating, or I can address the need by calling David and saying, David, gosh, I'm feeling so alone today. Do you have 10 minutes to talk to me and just chit chat for a minute? And that's what addicts don't do, the latter. We just go straight to the masturbation or the porn, which actually makes the loneliness worse.
Right.
Ultimately.
Right. So. Right. And I just want to underscore what you said, Scott. So important. And that underneath that feeling is an unmet need. And I think, and we're terrible at figuring out what that need is. And it's one of the things we do at Seek Integrity also, almost every morning and check-in is like, okay, well, name a need you have today. And it just makes people kind of do some self-examination and try to figure it out. But it's not something we're used to doing. And we jump right to the self-soothing as opposed to kind of a healthier process.
Yeah, and then let's just take this into the empathy realm. As an addict, I couldn't identify what I was feeling most of the time because I was always avoiding my feelings. I had the inkling of a feeling and I ran,
right,
let alone the need under it. And empathy is being able to identify your feeling and the need under it and experience it with you. I got to be able to get through my own first before I can feel your feelings and your needs and maybe address your needs. I mean, empathy is I feel your feelings. I know what you need, ideally, and I do something about it. This is a healthy, happy relationships. People have that kind of empathy with each other. But addicts, we can't even do that for ourselves. So it does take us a while. Going back to the first question we had, it does take a while to build true empathy. It's a process. So yeah. My therapist told me he, assuming that's the addict, does not have empathy and he will be working on it. Before I found out about the sex and porn addict problem, he had always been a task-oriented person. We are very distant from each other. He is still showing himself as a task-oriented person. Is there hope with a man who is 65? Great question.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think there's hope for everybody. I've had clients in their 80s, starting out in their 80s, in recovery after 60 years of actively acting out, and they do fine. There's age is not I believe, not a factor. It's just it's what we bring to it. Are we willing to admit we're powerless and surrender a little bit to the process and be willing to look at self-examination? And is it harder as we get older? Absolutely, but it's not impossible. It certainly can be done. And I think the task business is interesting to me. I think the task model, of course, is the classic Carnes model for treating sex addiction, and it's very well thought out and laid out and kind of follows a sequence. And so I think a lot of therapists follow that. A lot of the tasks, I believe, at least in the early stages, are directly contribute to the ability to have empathy, and that we talked just now about how this really has to start with ourselves. And okay, what am I feeling? What do I need? How is this? What do I believe about myself and my ability to meet my needs? All that stuff is kind of swirling around, and the tasks really help us start to work through that. And so I think that's been very useful for people. So if you have a concern, I would talk to him about it, and see. A lot of therapists have more than one dance move, if you will, and so he might be able to work with you on that. But it may be that the task model that he seems to be following is a pretty good fit. But if you have feelings about it, what a great chance to practice connection. You know, a therapeutic relationship, honestly, is also a place to practice empathy and compassion, and to see if it starts to click, right? That's a pretty profound relationship. Therapists hear stuff that very few other people probably even know. So there's a certain level of intimacy and vulnerability there, and it's also great fertile ground to practice these skills in every way.
You know, I think part of this question about the addict being a task-oriented person is that he's always been a task-oriented person. And I do think being busy is a way to escape sometimes. It certainly was for me. So
Gotcha. Okay.
She may be worried that this questioner may be worried that he's getting more tasks. You know, is that holding him back? And probably not, for the reasons David just stated. In recovery, the tasks are about opening up emotionally.
Right.
Usually.
Thank you, Scott. Because that is I've focused on the Carnes task model there, but yeah,
which is a massive task model.
Right. Exactly. But I think, you know, there is something to be said for not. This goes back to what we were saying earlier about men. Men are kind of acculturated to do, right, to fix. I think one of the frustrations in a lot of relationships is that women often want to discuss and process, which I think is very helpful, and men just kind of jump to the solution. Well, let's fix it, and it's frustrating for everybody. So we really need to be able to go internal, and sometimes if we're too busy, that's hard to do. I had a sponsor, because that was me. I had a sponsor once say, "Why don't you focus on being and not doing?" And that simple thing was helpful for me. I could slip into sort of just, I'm here, I'm being, you know, experiencing feelings, whatever, without having to run from them, be busy, which really for me was an avoidance of feelings. So yeah, good point.
Yeah. I love this next one. And we've covered it before, but it's definitely worth covering again. What does trauma therapy consist of, and how far into recovery does that typically begin?
What a great question, and it never is old. So I mentioned that my belief is that every addict probably, and I say probably because the scientist in me says I should qualify it, but also let me just say every addict I've ever met and known and worked with has a lot of trauma in their past. And you know, I talked to our clients today about adverse childhood experiences, and these are things that involve all kinds of abuse. It can be neglect. It can be witnessing violence or being the victim of violence in the home, mental illness in the home, addiction, even a sick sibling, a chronically ill sibling. It kind of gets all the attention, all the oxygen in the family goes to that one. All those things can kind of create an adverse child experiences, and all those result in trauma, or can result in trauma. And trauma really is this kind of dysfunctional pattern that a lot of addicts fall into as they get older. So trauma therapy, then, that begs the question. Trauma therapy is really important. What does trauma therapy consist of? What we know about trauma is that it's not just a cognitive problem. It's not just a problem up here in our heads. It's a problem in our whole body. And so that what that means is that good trauma therapy is not just talk therapy. There's some talk involved, but you're not going to get anywhere to resolve your trauma if you're sitting in two chairs in an office having a conversation. Trauma therapy has to be connected not only to our thoughts, but to our body, because we know trauma actually resides and gets embedded in our body. There's a wonderful book by a psychiatrist named Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score, where he highlights how trauma gets embedded in our bodies, and it can really, it takes work. It takes what we call a somatic or physical component of trauma therapy to get it out. And so that can be breath work. It can be, I do EMDR, and EMDR, we always kind of, where are you feeling on your body? And we're actively working with the body, and it gets released. So trauma therapy has to have what we call that somatic component, and all of them do. EMDR, somatic experiencing, even some of the tapping, emotional freedom tapping programs. There's a brain spotting. There's all kinds of things. So they all have that body connection. So then what does that mean? How do we do it, and when do we do it? So as I mentioned earlier, I think our addictions, I look at them as our coping skills. And they're not good ones, but that's how we've gone through life. And when we get into sobriety and recovery, we give them up. We have to give them up because they're killing us. And so there's a period of time, and I'd say 3 or 4 months, when people no longer have their old coping skills, but they don't yet have well-formed ones that are working for them. And so and I've seen this over and over again, if a well-meaning therapist says, let's do trauma work in that early phase of recovery, in the first couple months, I've seen more people than not get overwhelmed because they don't have the tools to deal with the emotions that come up. When we deal with trauma work, and trauma therapy is, it's well researched now and really perfected, but inevitably, you're dealing with painful situations, right? And so people need to be able to deal with those emotions as they come up. I have found that somebody in the first couple months of recovery is not able to handle that stuff, and so I really caution not getting into trauma therapy too soon. Even 90 days probably is okay to start. But if you're seeing a therapist, talk to them about it. If you're looking at different trauma therapies, make sure they have that somatic or body component, because that's a really critical piece to help. And the good news here is that trauma therapy has gotten really good, and trauma therapy is very effective, and it's not necessarily a lifetime's work. Trauma therapy is considered short-term therapy in many cases. So investigate it. Certainly, a lot of CSATs have gone on to get certified in different kinds of trauma therapy. And if they're not, I'm sure they have a network of people they can refer you to that they trust. But it's a great question. It's an important question, and I appreciate your asking it, because it's something most people need to know. And just be cautious about getting into it too soon. That's my big red caution.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And the big thing really is, make sure you've got some solid sobriety. Make sure you have a lot of coping skills in place that are healthy, and make sure you have a support network. If you've got those 3 things, you're probably ready for trauma therapy. But again, as David said, consult with your therapist first. Right. Don't take my word for it. Scott says I'm ready. No, don't do that. So, my partner and I struggle with his ADHD in our intimacy and recovery. ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Our intimacy outside of sexual relationship can be difficult to connect when it can be difficult to connect when he's so easily distracted. If I share with him, it's a struggle to keep him out of his head and to keep him connected and focused. It's hard for him to remember what I said I needed, liked, or found useful during our relational recovery. He also struggles remembering recovery tools from workshops, books, therapists, when either of us is triggered and he freezes or shuts down. It has been very frustrating to me as a partner, and I haven't found how to help him. David, thoughts?
Yeah, boy, there's a lot in there. ADHD is a real issue, and a significant number of sex addicts and porn addicts also have ADHD. And you've done a beautiful job describing kind of how that looks on the ground and how frustrating it can be if you're trying to carry on a conversation, or even, like in this case, really remember things that were useful to know. So a couple of things. ADHD is treatable. The recommended treatment typically is some kind of therapy, talk therapy, and usually some kind of medication that goes with it. Now, one warning, a lot of the medications to treat ADHD, in fact, the medications of choice are amphetamines, and amphetamines contribute to the intensity feeling that a lot of sex and porn addicts have when they're in their addiction. It's a body sensation. It's kind of an adrenaline thing. And so that can be disturbing for somebody. However, I've talked to many people who truly had ADHD, and once they got on the medication, it was like a life-changing experience. They were really able to focus and deal with stuff. So I don't know what kind of treatment he's had, but you might look into that, to the talk therapy and some kind of medication. Now, by the way, there are non-stimulant treatments for ADHD, notably Strattera. There's a couple of those out on the market now. A lot of people I've talked to with ADHD don't feel those drugs are as effective. They take longer to work, but the research shows they can be effective. So in terms of other stuff, I'm trying to think of just things you can do to help. Sometimes if you're doing a check-in to avoid distraction, I found it's really helpful to face each other, hold hands, and make eye contact as you're doing this stuff. And that really tends to keep you focused. It just narrows the universe a little bit and down to that interaction. Those kind of little tricks and tips can help. I've seen guys and women with ADHD use different kind of tools to help them stay focused. So, Post-it notes, people writing down, having systems in place that can kind of correct for the distraction. There's one other thing I want to mention here that may be a little different than ADHD. You talked about how he gets, when he's triggered, he freezes and shuts down. To me, that's not so much ADHD as some kind of evidence of trauma. I mentioned, I think earlier, an example of it, if my dad yelled at me, we often see, like very frequently see, if our clients come in and they've had a parent who yelled, could be mother, could be father, or a relative or a coach or anybody, if they had experience as a young person of people yelling, that's usually overwhelming for a kid. And they develop a pattern of like dissociating, disconnecting. It's like literally emotionally escaping. And fast forward, 20 years, we're now married, and our wife or husband, who is not my father, but still the dynamic is the same. When they yell or raise their voice, I make it trigger to the point where I disconnect. And it's incredibly frustrating for everybody, because suddenly I'm at a loss for words. I'm not feeling anything. I'm kind of numb. I'm disconnected. Meanwhile, my partner is getting escalated because they can't understand why I'm not responding, and they're getting frustrated with me. And the whole thing can get kind of wacky. So what I recommend to my clients when they're triggered like that, and they need some skills to kind of re-regulate, but to disconnect for a moment, take 4 or 5 minutes and tell your partner, I need time. I need to go out, connect with this guy, make a call, do some breathing, whatever. The trick though is you have to come back, because I think many partners have the experience of like, well, we'll finish this later, and it never happens. So the deal is you have to come back. But I think it's really important for the person who's triggered, partner or addict, to be able to take care of themselves. And that almost always means removing themselves from that situation, if only briefly, before they come back together. So I think that little piece in there about the triggering might be more of a trauma-related thing than ADHD, but there's some tricks there to maybe deal with it.
Yeah, and you did, and Rob also did podcast with Dr. Todd Love, who's a specialist in ADHD and addiction. I put the
Yes.
Link to both of those in the chat feature. Those are definitely worth listening to. And I'll just add one practical piece of advice. And this isn't just for addicts with ADHD, it's for all of us. I carried my circle plan in my wallet, a printed out version of my circle plan for the first couple years of my sobriety, because with or without ADHD, and I do not have that, thankfully, I couldn't remember what to do when I was triggered. I couldn't remember what to do when, I was in a fight, flight, freeze situation, or an emotional trigger or a visual trigger. I couldn't remember what to do. I knew what my bottom line behaviors were. I knew what my slippery behaviors were. I could not remember my tools and my healthy behaviors. I kept it for my green circle. for the healthy behaviors, and I would pull it out of my wallet. This was before smartphones; you can put it in your phone now. But I had a little tiny printed out version of my circle plan, and I would pull it out in difficult moments, and it really helped me. I would remember, oh, I can do breath work for a second and calm down. Oh, I can excuse myself and call my sponsor and come back in 5 minutes. But I couldn't remember those tools on my own.
And that's typical, Scott. When we get under stress, and it can be emotional stress, even physical stress, our bandwidth kind of gets small, right? We don't have the capacity to kind of remember or certainly not to generate ideas. My sponsor always told me to have your solutions ready made, because when you're in that moment, you can't think of the right thing to do, right? You need to actually have it. And we at Seek Integrity, we have those emergency fire drill things where we take these safety protocols and kind of run them like we do with kids in fire drills, so they're automatic, they're muscle memory. That's really important.
Yeah, and when I like to teach that class to my guys in the work groups. I never get to do it with at Sila, but I always talk about, the first day of kindergarten. They say, okay, we're going to have a fire drill. That little red alarm is going to go off in 30 seconds. And you're all going to line up. I'm going to stand by the door and face in, and you're going to line up single file, be quiet. I'm going to count hit. They go through it. And then everybody knows it's not a problem. So they're not panicked, and they do it. And then the next time they say, we're going to have a fire drill sometime today. And you do it that way for a while. And then the next time they have a fire drill, they don't tell the kindergartners, but they've done it enough. The plan is in place. They know the alarm signal. They just line up and do what they're supposed to do. Now, the teachers are also coached to say, even if it's a real fire, it's not a real fire, it's just a drill, so the kids don't panic. But it works, and the kids know what to do. And if you can teach 5-year-olds how to respond in a crisis, surely you can teach an adult male addict how to respond in a crisis. But you've got to have the response prepped and preferably practiced. As David mentioned, we do make the guys practice.
Right. Really important.
Yeah. If you don't practice, it doesn't work.
Can I just say one more thing about that? I think this is a mistake I made, and that's making calls. Mm-hmm. And that I consider that part of that practice as well, making calls to outreach. And I was one of those people that told myself, my problems aren't that important. I don't want to burden somebody else with, my issues. And I put it off until one day I really was in trouble and I needed to call somebody, but I hadn't called anybody till then. And then my dialogue was like, I never called when I was feeling great. How can I call now? So I think making those calls on good days, just getting in the habit of making calls, even one call is really, really important to stay. We've talked about intimacy and connection. It's all about that. And there's an old AA slogan, which I love: one call saves 2 lives. Meaning, if I call because I'm in desperate trouble to my friend Scott, I'm helped. But guess what? We know from experience that Scott is also helped by that process. And I've been the recipient of calls, and I feel grateful and happy to help, and I'm also get some little bit of healing myself. So it's not a burden; it's kind of a gift, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Okay, what can a betrayed partner do after discovery if their partner/addict is still raging at them, targeting them, and blaming them? Sadly, that happens a lot. It is the addict's initial reaction is, "Oh, not my fault, your fault." David, what can you do?
Yeah, so as is obvious, right? These are kind of warning signs that things are not right in that recovery process. When we see blaming, avoiding, taking responsibility, arguing, raging, this is all bad stuff, right? This is not healthy. It's not helpful. And especially after discovery, I mean, it's not helpful anytime, but at that point, you'd think that kind of, I would expect a little bit more healing would be in process, right? So I think what do you do? Boundaries. And work with, hopefully you're in, have a CSAT or somebody who can maybe help you, support you as you create some boundaries, because this is not okay. It's not okay for you to be blamed. It's certainly not okay for anybody to rage at anybody, or emotionally or physically, and to target. I mean, all this stuff is bad. And so boundaries are there, remember, to protect you. And so I'd really work with somebody with experience in this field. Even, by the way, we have support groups for betrayed partners here at Sex Relationship Healing, where you could also get some great ideas by sharing this in one of those groups, I bet. But boundaries would help you set limits. And remember, the thing about boundaries is you have to be able to, pull the trigger if the boundary gets crossed. You need to follow through. But I think it's really important, and this is just not okay. And that may be, hopefully, the wake-up call this person needs to kind of get back on track. But that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is taking care of you and being treated with respect and consideration. And we started out talking about empathy and intimacy. This is so far from that, right? This is back in old addict behavior that just is not okay.
Yeah, and when you set these boundaries, there's kind of a formula, just real quick. When you blame me for your choices, I feel X, Y, and Z. In the future, if you blame me, for me to feel safe, I am going to ask you to leave the house and stay out for 24 hours, or I am going to leave the house, or, but you said, this is the behavior, this is how it causes me to feel. And in the future, if this happens again, this is how I will respond. I will respond by, packing my bags and going to my mother's for the next week. But make sure you say, when you do this, this is how it causes me to feel.
Right. And that's a beautiful kind of STEM sentence, because it lays out the facts, right? This is your behavior. You're not saying the behavior is that person's responsibility, right? You're just saying, this is what you're doing. This is how it's making me feel. And there's kind of no arguing with that, honestly. It's a fact. So I agree. And
could you please repeat 3 things I need to have in place before I start trauma therapy? The list I had was some solid sobriety under your belt, 90 days, I think David suggested. I agree with that, at least 90 days.
At least 90.
Second one, coping skills. You need to be able to cope with your uncomfortable feelings in a healthy way, which goes to the green circle of the circle plan we just discussed and the emergency exit plan we just discussed. And then the third thing is a solid recovery support network in place, because trauma therapy is triggering and you need other people beside your therapist that you can talk to. David, did you have a different list, or?
No, that's it. You nailed it. That's good.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. My spouse has very poor eye contact in conversation. I can't really recall when I noticed this, but now it's really frustrating. He will say, I am listening. What's up with this? Is this a habit he has developed from being dishonest for years? So lack of eye contact.
Yeah, lack of eye contact. It's really disturbing when that happens. And if we see it in the course of therapy or treatment, we call it out, because that's really kind of an avoidance behavior. Now, where that's coming from could be a lot of different things, right? I'm not sure what, in this case, what caused it, but it's really evidence of a disconnect, and it's, people interpret it, they take it personally, but I think oftentimes it's about the person themselves. It's about their inability to deal with intensity or connection or intimacy, and a lot of it, I think, is shame. There's various ways that shame gets expressed, and one of them is that, or downcast eyes. But I think I think it's, to approach this with a little empathy, I would bet there's some shame and issues there that this person's experiencing. I know how maddening it is, though, to be trying to talk to somebody and they're listening, but as human beings, we really rely on eye contact. So hopefully he's working on that. It sounds like if I'm listening, you may be just defensive and not moving on that situation, but it is really important to have that eye contact, and because otherwise, you know, when we talk about the need for intimacy or empathy, that's all about connection. And when we aren't making eye contact, we are basically disconnected. And although we're listening, we can hear, but it's not the same. And so I would really encourage him to work on some of the root causes. I suspect there's some trauma there, honestly, that is feeding that, because that's a pretty severe reaction to being able to have interaction with other people. And it really all goes back to how I am feeling about myself. If I'm feeling really unworthy, unlovable, damaged goods, you know, whatever, that kind of gets reflected through shame and with that behavior. So I'd be, I know how frustrating it is. I think I try to be a little gentle about encouraging him to work on it. It's not okay just to live the rest of your life like this, right? But I think it's probably not just, he's not just being stubborn. I think there's probably more to it that needs to be kind of uncovered.
Yeah, I mean, well said. I know for me, if I am not looking at someone when we're conversing, I am distancing myself from them. I am not paying much attention. I am definitely not fostering empathy and intimacy. I'm disconnecting. It might be because I'm bored or I don't care, but probably it's because I'm feeling uncomfortable, and mostly because of my shame.
Right.
And we see it in therapy all the time. Guys will start to tell you something that they're ashamed of, and they look away or they look down. And I know one of the things that you do with the guys after that is, you know, you'll let them get it out, but then you say, okay, now I want you to look each member of the group in the eye and maybe let them give you some feedback, you know, and it's a really powerful thing for the guys who receive this.
Oh my God, it's huge, because, you know, if I'm revealing a secret or something I did, you know, 30 years ago or something, and I am afraid you're going to judge me and I'm going to be excluded and all the worst fears that go with that. And when people can muster the courage to do that and make eye contact, you're exactly right, Scott. It's incredibly powerful, because I think, as I mentioned earlier, when we're vulnerable and truly vulnerable like that, I've never seen it not work, where people didn't like lean forward with some compassion and empathy to hear it. And most often people identify with it. But in any case, it's a tremendously healing event, because suddenly that person feels connected. Those shame things that we carry are a little like walls that keep us separate from everybody else. And that's one wall knocked down when that happens. And it's really important.
Yeah. Yeah, to quote Brene Brown, shame thrives in darkness, it withers in sunlight. And the sunlight is the eye connection after
Exactly.
revealing it, I think.
Yep.
So yeah, we are out of time. We're also out of questions. David, great topic today. Thank you. I put the link for David's work group, which starts next Monday.
Right.
In there, it's about health. It's for male recovering addicts. The first 6 weeks, part 1 is healthy intimacy. The second 6 weeks, part 2 is healthy sexuality. We do require that you do part 1 before you do part 2. There's a reason for that. Yeah, I mean, it just works better that way. David, anything you want to say to take us out about today's topic or anything else?
Yeah, just hope people check out the workshop if they're interested in it. It's a really important one. There's not many places you can get this information, frankly. So check it out. And as we've talked about it tonight, it's an important and very relevant issue.
Yeah, it's a great workshop to take when you've got some recovery under your belt and you want to repair your relationship and move forward into a happier connection with your partner. Highly recommended. So, all right, everybody, thank you for being here. We will be back next week, and we'll see you then.
Okay, take care, Scott. Bye-bye.